This episode is brought to you by Progressive.
Are you driving your car or doing the laundry right now? Podcasts go best when they're bundled with another activity, like Progressive home and auto policies. They're best when bundled too.
Having these two policies together makes insurance easier and could help you save. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save over $775 on average.
Quote a home and car bundle today at Progressive.com.
Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $779 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states.
History as it happens, October 1st, 2024. Russia's Exiles.
The biggest prisoner swap since the end of the Cold War has taken place between Russia and the West.
What happened to me, I do not see as an exchange. I see this as an illegal expulsion from Russia.
Prominent Kremlin critics and anti-war campaigners.
It also says a lot about us that this deal includes the release of Russian political prisoners. They stood up for democracy and human rights. Their own leaders threw them in prison. The United States helped secure their release as well.
Russian emigres and exiles may not be able to change, let alone save their country, locked in the grip of the Putin autocracy, at war in Ukraine, in a long conflict with the West. But the exiles are important beyond the realm of politics. They enrich Western societies and remind us of what real courage and intellectual tenacity look like. That's next as we report History as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Solzhenitsyn, when he left the Soviet Union as a dissident and as a Nobel Prize-winning author eventually, was fit into a whole Cold War narrative in the United States about sort of a warrior against Sovietism. You know, there was the expectation that he would wave the banner of American liberalism and support American political ideas, which in some respects he did, but in many respects he did not.
We should start with Alexei Navalny, who was a unique figure, I would say, in Russia, who sought to engage people politically and succeeded up to a point. It would be wrong to say that he had no constituency. It was limited, but what he was able to do and what nobody else was able to do in Russia in recent years, when politics was basically all but banned, independent politics, when it was extremely risky to play independent politics in Russia, Alexei Navalny was able to engage people.
At a news conference in Berlin, just days after being released from a Russian prison in a historic East-West prisoner exchange, the opposition politician Ilya Yashin said he actually didn't want to be there. He did not ask to be released. His place was in Russia.
I understood that being in prison was not just an anti-war struggle, but it was just a struggle to have the right to live in my country and to be involved in independent politics in my country and to say what I need to be, what I feel needs to be said in my country. I was defending my right to live and to work in my country, my own country. Until the last day, I fought for my right to remain in Russia.
Well, in Russia, Yashin was sentenced in late 2022 to 8.5 years in prison. His crime? Criticizing Russia's war in Ukraine. He was convicted of spreading false information after saying on YouTube that hundreds of corpses were found in the Kyiv suburb of Bucha after Russian forces withdrew from the area in March 2022, some bound and shot at close range. Now, we know that what he said was not false. Russian troops did commit a massacre there. But in Putin's autocracy, the truth is dangerous.
State prosecutors asked the Mishyansky court in Moscow on Wednesday for a 9-year sentence for the opposition leader, stemming from charges of deliberately spreading fakes about the Russian army. The maximum sentence under Russia's relatively new criminal code article on fakes about the army is 10 years.
In an essay for Foreign Affairs, Michael Kimmage and Maria Lipman write, Yashin's desire to pursue independent politics in Russia, even after having been in prison for pursuing independent politics, is understandable. The country's political future will be written not in Berlin or London or New York, but in Russia itself. It'll be written by those who live out the war there, whether or not they support it. To leave leave is to lose the opportunity to participate in the process and to abandon the country in wartime, inviting shame and stigma, especially for those who settle in the West. To leave is also to join the exiled opposition, an unstructured network far removed from the levers of power in Moscow. Kimmage and Lipman go on to say it is in the West's self-interest to grant political asylum to Russians fleeing Putin's despotism and to direct funding in a manner that promotes their cultural and intellectual contributions. Russian oppositionists in exile face nearly insurmountable challenges, they say. They lack ideological unity, they lack a political party, and unlike the Bolsheviks, they lack a clear sense of purpose. Indeed, what is commonly referred to as the opposition is fragmented and prone to endemic squabbling. Russian dissidents abroad share no consensus on what a post-Putin Russia should look like. It is difficult to imagine this splintered and scattered opposition arriving at a consensus anytime soon. And they say Western governments have largely welcomed the Russian dissidents, but have naively projected their own beliefs onto them. Going forward, they should bear several truths in mind. One is that the opposition has no chance of acquiring power in Russia in the foreseeable future. Its prospects were dim before the war, and they're even dimmer now. Again, Michael Kimmage and Maria Lipman, writing in Foreign Affairs, the official publication of the Council on Foreign Relations. I will share a link to this essay in my weekly newsletter. Sign up at historyasithappens.com or search for History As It Happens on Substack. And just a programming note here. In my most recent episode and in last week's newsletter, I did say that this episode was going to be about Israel and Lebanon and the anniversary of the Sabra and Shatila massacres. I had my guests line up, but they had to cancel, which does happen from time to time in this business. And it left me with no option but to change things up a bit, so I hope to return to the escalating war in the Middle East in my next episode. Back to today's topic. Dissidents such as Ilya Yashin or Vladimir Kara-Murza, who was also released in the prisoner swap, are important voices for a better Russia. As their country continues to prosecute a war in Ukraine with no end in sight, and with U.S. support for Ukraine potentially hinging on who wins the November election. If they face imprisonment or death for speaking out at home, they may not be able to influence Moscow from a distance. Their importance may lay outside of politics alone. You know Michael Kimmage. He's been on the podcast many times, Catholic University history professor, expert on Russia and the Cold War. But now he is the Richard C. Holbrooke Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin. Maria Lipman is a visiting research scholar at the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at George Washington University and the co-editor of the Institute's website, Russia.post. Michael Kimmage, welcome back.
Wonderful to be back, Martin.
Joining us from Germany, a new post for this semester.
That is very true. The Richard C. Holbrooke Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin.
And Maria Lipman, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here.
Happy to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
I want to thank you both for writing your thought-provoking essay in Foreign Affairs. Maria, our listeners are not familiar with you or your work. You haven't been, or maybe they are, but you haven't been on the show yet. You also are an exile from Russia. Can you tell us briefly a little bit about your background, where you were born in Russia or the former Soviet Union, and why you left?
Gladly, and thank you for this question. I was born in Moscow in 1952. Lived there, born, raised, had my family there. Lived in the same apartment for the past 40 years, up until early March of 2022. When within days after the Russian large-scale invasion in Ukraine, my husband and I got up and went, just locked the door to our apartment, grabbed a few bags, and left. And I haven't been back since.
And you left because?
I left for maybe more than one reason, but I think the most important one was the immediate emotional shock that so many in my country experienced following the news that my country invaded its neighbor. There were other considerations later. There were family. Our daughter's family left with our grandchildren. That was a factor, but that came later. The first one was the moral impossibility to stay in the country, which had committed this horrible act.
And dissent is now illegal. Well, it's never really been an open society recently under Putin, of course, but especially now.
Of course, it's illegal. I would not consider myself a dissident. I've been in journalism for many, many years of my life, but more as an editor than a contributor. However, in terms of my thinking and my attitudes, of course, I share the views of those who considered themselves dissidents.
Well, thank you for that personal story. And the fact that you were born in Moscow in 1952 while Stalin was still alive, I'm fascinated by this subject. And I know we need to get to our topic here. But the work of Alexievich, her first name is escaping me at the moment, where she's talked to people who lived under communism. Secondhand Time is the name of the book. Maybe we can connect in a future episode to talk about what life was like in the Soviet Union and your thoughts on what life is like now in Russia. You're not obligated to take me up on that offer. Okay, so the very existence of an exile or émigré community. This may sound like an obvious thing, but as I read your essay, it dawned on me, not every country has one of these. I mean, maybe there is an American émigré community, but certainly not an exile community. In the United States, we don't think of ourselves as having to be dissident thinkers or artists who need to escape our own country's government because of political persecution. We do have a First Amendment here. But this is an inescapable part of Russian history because, as you say in your essay, engaging in independent politics is not permitted. Wasn't permitted under the Tsars, the USSR, except for a short time at the very end, and then the Putin regime. Michael Kimmage, your general thoughts on this subject?
I wouldn't be too categorical about the Russian past in this regard. I think that there are many different phases and periods, and political repression has waxed and waned, and that's intersected, I think, with complicated patterns of Russian interaction with the outside world. So I would say in better times, there's often been a very, in a sense, calm, normal interaction with the outside world of people just going back and forth and taking in what can be taken in from the outside world. But in periods of greater difficulty, certainly that has generated waves of emigration. And one thinks in particular of sort of 1917 and the aftermath of that. And then in ways that we explore in this essay, February 2022 and a particular wave of emigration that it generated. There are different tracks along which one can analyze this phenomenon. And, in terms of cultural creativity, there's actually a productive relationship between emigration and many different forms of cultural creativity. But one of the things that we point out in the essay is that unlike other countries, some other countries where diaspora communities have at times come back and reconstituted the country or the nation, that unbalance, or for the most part, is just not the Russian pattern. So, you might think of Charles de Gaulle living in London during the Second World War, and then after the Second World War, he becomes a part of post-war French politics and life, and that's, for the most part, not what we found or what we've seen in Russian history.
Talking about other countries that had immigrants who sought to change things in their countries and were able to do so, I think probably the best example is Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran, who immigrated and spent a long time in mostly France, and then came back to do a revolution in his country, the Islamic Revolution. And actually, the political order that was established by that revolution stayed in place for probably much longer than many people could anticipate outside of Iran and maybe in Iran as well. And I think this makes this figure not dissimilar from that of the Russian Bolsheviks. And first and foremost, Vladimir Lenin, who also entertained ideas about what he wanted his country to be politically and actually the world. His ambition was even broader than Russia proper. Thinking about what he thought was a just political order, writing about it, disseminating his and his allies' writings and leaflets and books and articles, and eventually coming back to Russia in presiding over the proletarian revolution and instituting a regime which, with some changes, but survived again much longer than many people anticipated, for about 70 years. And when I say longer than many people anticipated, I'm thinking first and foremost about the so-called first wave of Russian immigration, people who fled Russia following the Bolshevik Revolution and following the very bloody fratricidal civil war, and believing for quite a number of years that it was all like a bad dream, a nightmare. There cannot be a Bolshevik Russia, that they would be able to return and bring back their Russia, or what they thought was their Russia, bring it back and overturn the horrible developments associated with the Bolshevik Revolution. But of course, it never happened.
Talk about unintended consequences of poorly thought out ideas. The Germans sending Lenin back because they thought it would help them in the war effort because he wanted to foment unrest and revolution. We know what happened after that. But he is, as you say, the exception to this rule, right, of an exile being able to go back to his country and effect change. But over the period of time you're addressing in your essay here, going back to the home country and reshaping the politics, very difficult. It's usually the exception. Even shaping the politics from a distance is very hard. Yet exiles serve an important purpose. That's really the gist of what you're saying, right?
But what we're distinguishing between in the essay, I would say, is the creative purpose of exile communities and diaspora communities, which is not just in the Russian case, but in many cases is extraordinary, and the political purpose. As we've been going back and forth about, it's of course true that you have Lenin, the exile, who comes back and reconstitutes the country in the most dramatic possible way. And that's, a striking and very important historical example. But in other regards, I think both Maria and I are very skeptical about diaspora communities or exiled communities from Russia of more recent vintage serving any kind of political purpose. We just can't really envision it. Of course, it may happen. Life is unpredictable, but it's not something that we can envision. But still less do we think that Western governments should be in the business of trying to determine what that purpose would be, or trying to plan for it, or to think in those terms. And that's, of course, where the German General Staff is a striking example, because exactly as you say, Martin, it's very much unintended consequences in that case, and probably would be in ours if there were the power to, sort of refashion Russia in the image of this or that diaspora figure or exile figure. So at the same time that we should have esteem and consideration, care and concern for people who are living in diaspora communities, I think we both strongly believe that there should be no messianic or really any political program attached to them. You can, have a political lens and you cannot have a political lens. In this case, it would be better not to have one.
Well, Maria, the point is that exiles have their own politics. We can't project our meaning U.S. politics and purposes onto them and use them for our reasons. You make this point explicitly in the piece. Just going back to your own experience, in your essay, you talk about how Russian exiles have to be very careful about sounding like Russians. They don't want their country to lose the war or whatever it is, right? They're not necessarily liberal Western Democrats. We may agree with them on one or two points, but not everything. But your point is you have to be very careful as a Russian exile not to say the wrong thing.
Indeed, theirs is a very difficult situation. And when I say theirs, what I mean is an unknown number of people who would define themselves or be defined by outsiders as the opposition. This is a term that we come across rather often as applies to these people. My point and our point, and there is full agreement between the two of us with Michael, that actually it is wrong to refer to those people as the opposition. We should be talking about oppositionists, about small opposition groups, about people who share anti-war attitudes and, of course, are opposed to the current Russian government. And this would be an understatement, who consider themselves and are considered by the government as the enemies. And the government considers most of them as foreign agents. But they do not form what might be referred to as the opposition, as a political force with a program, with anything like a political discipline, a recognized leader, a set of goals, a policy, none of that. Many of them are well-educated, very smart. Many of them are very brave, courageous people. These days, after the swap of prisoners between the United States and Russia, there are people among that group who had sacrificed their freedom and apparently were ready to sacrifice their lives for the sake of staying in Russia and probably playing a role in Russian politics later, but have lost this opportunity with the swap. So this is what we're talking about, not an opposition, not a political force. but a number of individuals, some of them can be admired for courage, their intellectual achievements, their ability to address their audience at home and the audience among fellow immigrants and be persuasive and be interesting. And actually, some of them have huge loyal audiences online, of course, but not a political force. And I think it is important to be shrewd on this point for themselves and for those in the West who probably have unjustified expectations on that group.
If I could add one further point here, which comes from the essay, that we look at the historical example of Lenin as the paradigmatic revolutionary who comes from abroad, but we also look at the example of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and it speaks really to the point that you were making a moment ago, Martin, about applying templates to people that don't necessarily apply. Solzhenitsyn, when he left the Soviet Union as a dissident and as a Nobel Prize-winning author eventually, was fit into a whole Cold War narrative in the United States about sort of a warrior against Sovietism. There was the expectation that he would wave the banner of American liberalism and support American political ideas, which in some respects he did, but in many respects he did not. And so he harbored his own political views in a kind of ironic turn. He goes back to Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union and explores, different kinds of nationalist and conservative ideas, one of which is a kind of bond of allegiance among the peoples of Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus, which becomes important for Putin's thinking and is there in the background of the February 2022 invasion. It's not to say that this is caused by his emigration, but it's one of the ways in which people didn't understand, I think, who Solzhenitsyn was. So these kind of simplistic templates, narrative expectations, and we see this not just with Russia, but you could think of somebody like Ahmed Chalabi, who was supposed to be the liberal savior of Iraq in 2003. That's not only a matter of inaccuracy, but it can be quite dangerous to misunderstand things as at times we in the U.S. do.
Chalabi was a con man. Solzhenitsyn was a reactionary, right?
Solzhenitsyn was not a liberal, certainly not a Westernizer. Solzhenitsyn did not choose to go to exile. Solzhenitsyn was kicked out from his country by his government. And he actually never liked it in the West. He criticized the West very harshly. He was a Russian nationalist. And some of his ideas, by the way, were picked up by Putin personally in recent years, actually about this kind of imaginary Slavic nation, that we're all one nation. And from this, of course, Putin made a conclusion that Ukraine does not exist as a nation. It is all one overarching Russian nation. Solzhenitsyn still was a gigantic figure, a figure of immense scope. But he was a solitary figure, and this too is very important. He was not, by no means, was he a leader of a dissident movement. And actually, there are two gigantic figures among Russian dissidents of the 70s, and the other, of course, is academician Sakharov, who held completely different ideas, and they disagreed on very important issues. Just to give you an idea that looking at this example of these two giants, who disagree completely about what Russia should be. In Solzhenitsyn, we have if you like, a reactionary and a Russian nationalist, of course, an anti-communist. But with Sakharov, we have a Westernizer and a liberal who actually argued for the possibility, for a potential of a convergence between the warring side and the Cold War, between the communist world and the democratic capitalist world.
In some ways, I think he's really useful to our overall argument, because none of the politics looked at from a U.S. point of view, none of the politics works out in the right way. It's all, a series of unintended consequences. And if people could even have imagined the kind of link that would one day exist between Solzhenitsyn and Putin, I think it just would have been completely unfathomable to the Cold Warriors who saw all of this potential in Solzhenitsyn. But, his book, The Gulag Archipelago, is not only a book that's important in the context of its times, it's one of the great contributions to political writing in the 20th century. So we could have all kinds of arguments now in real time or retrospectively about the different political positions that Solzhenitsyn took, but he is a giant of world literature and a giant of 20th century political thinking. And so in some ways, if you think more of the intellectual and cultural contributions of him in particular, but also of his cohort, you have something very valuable. And in some ways, if you put that value in the center of your perception, I think you start to see with much greater clarity kind of where we were and where we are with these different diaspora communities. If your litmus test is only politics, I think that storyline sadly ends in just a lot of frustration.
Yeah, it's tragic to see anyone driven out of their country, but we are enriched by their presence here, and not just politically, or not at all politically. It's literature, art, ballet, science, what have you. So I want to talk about whether Russia, modern Russia, has ever had a time when independent politics was possible. We know that end of the Gorbachev period and some part of the 1990s, yes, but it didn't last. And I want to get to what the consequences of that were and are. But I want to go back to something you both alluded to before. Today's exiles. You mentioned Ilya Yashin in your essay. He was just released in the prisoner swap. Most Americans, I hope, are familiar with the name Alexei Navalny, who died. He was an exile or an emigre, and he went back to Russia to try to make a difference. But you say that they don't have constituencies. They're not really the head of a movement. Why? Why no constituency?
We should start with Alexei Navalny, who was a unique figure, I would say, in Russia, who sought to engage people politically and succeeded up to a point. It would be wrong to say that he had no constituency. It was limited, but what he was able to do and what nobody else was able to do in Russia in recent years, when politics was basically all but banned, independent politics, when it was extremely risky to play independent politics in Russia, Alexei Navalny was able to engage people. And he was able, against all odds, not only to play politics himself and try to run, and he actually ran once for Moscow mayor and gained a sizable number of votes, came in second after the incumbent. But he was able to establish around Russia what he called Navalny's headquarters, small groups of people who engaged in local politics, who ran for local offices, and some of them even won. It was in the middle of that campaign that Navalny was poisoned, and then we know what happened. Recovered in Germany, came back, was arrested, jailed, and died, or some believe was killed. But he was unique in this respect. Even so, his attraction, his political attraction and his political support was limited. People were aware of him, which was in itself a miracle to generate an awareness of about 50%, according to the polls in Russia, by a figure who was totally ignored by state media. But when asked a very simple question in polls, would you vote for Navalny for president? Only about maybe 5 or 7% would say yes. Of course, this is not the same as taking part in an actual presidential campaign, but it was not at all dangerous at that time to say, yes, I would like this man for president. People admired him for the videos exposing corruption, and he had a gigantic audience, and people appreciated his sense of humor and his ability to explain complicated schemes in a simple way so that everybody would understand. People admired the way he exposed powers that be, but this does not necessarily make him a figure with strong political following. Now, after his untimely death, I think Russia does not have anyone who can compare. And sadly, what follows, what has been happening including just very recently, is vicious feud between Navalny's associates and some other people who also qualify as dissidents or political emigres, which of course is deleterious to the reputation of both sides, the critics and those criticized.
I think it's very important to be cautionary about the totalitarianism model for the Soviet Union and for post-Soviet Russia. It's certainly the case if you go to the end phase of the Soviet Union that you have lots of independent politics. It's not party politics necessarily, and it's not expressed through formal movements or elections, but it's certainly a lot of ferment that was there in the 1980s that I would describe as independent. In the 1990s, you have a profusion of independent politics of almost every different form. And really until quite recently, probably the February 2022 war, it was a manipulated political system. Managed democracy is a term that the Kremlin itself used to describe the political order, but there was a lot of independent politics in the sense of debate, discussion, and as the Navalny example demonstrates, the possibility for people outside of the system to run for office. And I don't think that even now, repressive as things has become, and the mandated support for the war is certainly there, I don't think that independent politics has disappeared. I just think it's become very privatized. And it's one of the very interesting questions about the future is what is that independent politics? What is the conversation about the war going to be within the context of that independent politics? And I would say, would be curious if you would agree, Maria, I would say that we just don't know. You know, we can say now that there's a high level of support for the war or everybody is against the war behind closed doors, but we really just don't know what's percolating and happening in the worlds of independent politics. But I would want to emphasize the point that independent politics do exist, but it's probably around the kitchen table and it's among trusted people and perhaps in certain corners on the internet that I would be less certain of. And it will take us in very unpredictable directions, but it does exist.
Well, of course, it depends very much on the definition of how we understand politics. If we understand politics as political contestation, according to the law, as contested elections, this does not exist in Russia anymore. And if we look back at Russia's history, of course, there was this period preceding the Bolshevik Revolution and for actually a few years after that, when there was a contested and very lively, contentious politics. One more such period was what Michael mentioned, beginning in late 80s and through the 90s, the time when politics was lively. There were political parties, there were contested elections. Some would describe, and some in Russia would want to describe both periods as chaos, as actually the time of disarray, abnormal for Russia. The time when actually the state collapsed. In the first instance, it was, of course, the Imperial Russia. In the second case, it was the Soviet Union. So the collapse of the state, followed by a time of turmoil. And a unique periods, almost unique periods in Russian history when the state weakened, and the state weakened dramatically. So instead of the omnipotent state, there was a weak state. But this did not necessarily, in my view, lead to the empowerment of the people. So in both instances, it was weak state, weak people, and gradually the state actually grabbing back or reinstating its power over the people.
Every country has a politics. North Korea, Myanmar, Russia. It's not necessarily a mass politics. So to this issue of why don't these exile figures like Ilya Yashin have a constituency back home, I want you to address something about a generalization that is involved here, and it does have something to do with the disastrous 1990s, or so the story goes. Soviet Union collapses, this brief period of a flowering of intellectual and artistic freedom, and dissent is allowed, and we have all these different parties and people trying to enter the political system. But you had far-right figures like Vladimir Zhirinovsky, and you had unreformed communists on the left. And somewhere in the middle is Boris Yeltsin, who had an authoritarian strain himself. He was the choice of the United States, who was not a very effective leader. And this whole experience soured ordinary Russian people on this so-called experiment of democracy and market economics. And in the larger contexts of never really having a liberal democratic system in Russia ever, or rule of law society, again, the generalization is that today Russians may not like their government, but they're also not pining for mass, liberal, Western-style democratic politics. So here we are. There is no mass movement or constituency for these exiles, some of whom may not be pushing liberal democratic reforms anyway. Who wants to take on that maze-like setup, Michael Kimmage? It speaks to this generalization as to why, we're talking about exiles here and what can they shape, what can they influence. But there has to be a receptive audience for such ideas back home.
Well, and to a degree there is, and this is a very helpful question, Martin, because I think it allows us to highlight another aspect of the essay. I think it would be maybe too simplistic to say that the natural constituency for quote unquote opposition politicians or political figures, potential political leaders in Russia is educated classes of Russia's bigger cities, but that probably is roughly correct. And that's just not a big enough constituency to form a mass movement or a political party or to contend with the powers that be. So that's one point to bear in mind. But I think the one that's more apropos and the one that we really try to bring forward in the essay is what a catastrophe the war is for the Russian opposition in this regard. Of course, the war is a catastrophe in its own terms, but it's a catastrophe also in political terms because it imposes a burden that seems almost impossible to overcome in a sense, especially if you're living abroad. So, there are rules and etiquettes and expectations for Russians who are living abroad that they be anti-war, and many of them are sincerely. So that's not necessarily something that has to be invented. But the moment you appear in the West on those terms, in the midst of a very bloody war in which lots of Russian soldiers are dying, you're in a very tricky position back at home. If you were to go back at home, think back to Jane Fonda and the kind of critique of the American war effort and how she went to North Vietnam and she came back. And, even to this day, people are still angry about that.
Hanoi Jane is the moniker.
Right, that sort of turn of events. And I think that's the dilemma in which many people find themselves in the Russian opposition. So there, too, there's a question of what constituencies, what's Russia going to be at the end of this war? Or if Putin were somehow to fall and people could return from exile or from the diaspora, what kind of Russia would they find? That's sort of one question. But how do you manage this whole question of the war? And how do you do it when you lived abroad and people were back at home fighting the war? And so there, too, the relationship of opposition or oppositions to domestic political constituencies is simply immensely complicated and probably just a great disadvantage to somebody who's on the more nationalist side of the spectrum, who can sort of claim, as Putin does, to kind of represent Russia and to represent a kind of militant form of Russianism. That's going to be very difficult to push back against given these current conditions. It's in a sense unfair, but it seems an important part of the political setup to point out.
Well, I think it would be unfair to say that Ilya Yashin does not have a constituency in Russia. He probably does, and he certainly has a loyal audience of supporters, people who admire him, who were rejoicing that he was now free and his life is not under threat. It is a limited constituency, and I would say, again, a loyal audience at this point, people who would listen to him even despite the obstacles, because a lot of sources of information are blocked in Russia. You have to go around it. But what I want to point out is that imagine that as of tomorrow, there is independent politics in Russia. It is bad. It is a totally unrealistic scenario. But if we imagine a scene of contested politics, Russian liberals would not necessarily be the most popular force. After a brutalizing war in a population where actually quite a few have gone through this war, the popularity of liberals calling for moderation and for humanism and such like will inevitably be limited. Just think of agencies such as security and police, of course, the armed forces, the presence of war veterans in the country, the brutalized and traumatized population, or part of it. All of that should be taken into account if we are talking about a hypothetical, totally unrealistic scenario in which somebody like Ilya Yashin is able to return to Russia and play politics. Yes, there will be a constituency, but how limited is it going to be, and how vicious the competition of political forces might be? The example of Jane Fonda, I think, is a very important one, because this is the situation in which some among Russian political emigres find themselves these days. They are probably not going to Ukraine and actually cannot, but being in the West, with the West strongly assisting Ukraine in fighting Russia, with many among those political emigres existing on Western grants, and so receiving money from the same West that helps Ukraine defeat Russia, or at least this is the goal, puts them in a very, very difficult situation. They face terrible dilemmas as what their message to the Russian people is, and whether they are sending a message to those fellow Russians who are now outside of Russia or to those Russians who are still in Russia. I would cite just one example. Sure. At their very first press conference after the swap, Ilya Yashin and Vladimir Karamurza were talking about sanctions and how the West should be more careful in how they actually engineer sanctions.
Because they hurt ordinary people.
Yes, the concern, and especially voiced by Vladimir Karamurza, I think, was that sanctions should be rethought in such a way that they would not affect the Russian people, just the Russian government or the Russian military or whatever. Whether or not this is realistic as far as actually the setup of the sanctions is concerned, it inflicted upon both Ilya Yashin and Vladimir Kara-Murza a wave of criticism, and in some cases, vicious criticism, not only from Ukrainians. We are now in this internet world, so anyone can read and watch it. I understand Ukrainians, but also from fellow Russians who actually criticized these two heroes for not being anti-Russian enough, for not fighting fully with those who take very serious effort to defeat the Russian government, Russian army.
Wars have a way of erasing nuance, but go ahead, Maria.
Led one of the prominent liberal writers in Russia to write a bitter piece to say, so the sacrifice of those people immediately was reduced to nothing. That didn't mean anything to those who criticized them for not being anti-Russian enough. He was trying to shame his compatriots in that essay. Don't you remember that these people sacrificed their lives for you, for Russia, and which means for you? How dare you criticize them now for criticizing American or Western sanctions? So this is tricky. This is just to say, I'm not saying who's right, who's wrong, and which message was necessarily correct or not, but this just shows how complicated morally, and of course politically, if we understand politics in a broader sense.
There are really two very separate tracks when it comes to looking at these issues. There's the political track, where we could think about, what Russia's political future is, what maybe our preferences would be, expectations, and of course within that, how people interact with figures like Yashin and Kara-Murza and others, the political thread, the political storyline. But of course, there's also the geopolitical storyline, meaning, sort of warfare, contestation, etc. And of course, we are in the midst of a very bloody, brutal war, and that compels a whole other set of questions. So from a geopolitical point of view, you would just want, in a sense, sort of any Russian to be as supportive of the war effort as possible. That's kind of how things work in wartime. But looking at things from a political perspective, it's just a vastly different landscape. So it's good if one is able in one's mind to kind of disentangle these two things. And for the United States, sort of the final point I could make to you, Martin, it's not as if the United States is some kind of neutral bystander. It's not running a seminar on world politics where the question is, should Germany be this and should Russia be that and should China be that? The US is a very actively engaged geopolitical player, which is nothing to apologize for, but it's just a circumstance. It's a factor. It's a variable in all of this. And when it comes to the conversation about diaspora communities, it adds a whole other layer of complexity to that. I think something that is too rarely taken account in Washington, especially about conversations that just concern democracy and its antitheses, it needs to be democracy, its antitheses, and the whole geopolitical situation. And if we can bring those variables together, I think we arrive at a richer and truer form of analysis.
Maybe, Maria, a question is, what form does the Russian government in a post-Putin situation, Russian government and society have to take in order to have Russia rejoin the international community, whatever that means, or to go back to the status quo where we're not dealing with this terrible situation? It doesn't necessarily have to be a liberal Western-style democracy. Even during the Soviet Union, there were periods where relations between the Soviets and the West were better at times. There was cold periods during the Cold War, and there was a thaw for a while. Or as Sergei Radchenko has pointed out in his new book, Brezhnev wanted to, just get along with Nixon, and they'd have an understanding they can rule the world together. But maybe that example is not germane anymore, relevant anymore. We're not dealing with the Soviet Union. But you get my point, right? It's a question of where does Russia have to be if it's not going to be a liberal democracy anytime soon, which is a point you make in your essay. What form can Russia take where we're not in this terrible situation?
Well, I hope I don't have to answer this question.
An impossible question.
An impossible question that nobody has an answer to. What I would say instead is that indeed there were periods when the Soviet Union and the West and the United States cooperated. And of course, the most important example is World War II. And we shouldn't forget about that. The countries were allies in the war. What Sergei Radchenko implies periods of productive cooperation between the warring sides in the Cold War was when they were able to see a shared challenge or a shared danger threatening the mankind. And that was, of course, nuclear weapons and potential nuclear catastrophe. So it doesn't seem that today there is a shared challenge or shared danger to the mankind that actually is seen in the same way or similar way by the United States and more broadly the West and Russia. This on top, of course, of the horrible war in Ukrainian territory and currently even in parts of Russian territory, by the way, has changed the fact that the two sides have nothing to agree on. And more as time goes by, there is nothing left on which they can agree of important issues, not the climate change, not the Arctic, nothing of the issues that seemed to be shared issues for the mankind or for the largest, most important countries of the world to join efforts to work toward. Nothing of that seems to be there anymore. And this is what makes our future really alarming.
We thank Maria Lipman and Michael Kimmage. And speaking of alarming, as I was recording this episode, Israel bombed Beirut in an attempt to kill Hezbollah's leader, Nassan Nasrallah, estimates of hundreds of civilian casualties. But again, as I speak into this microphone, very little information has been confirmed in terms of Nasrallah's status and how many people were killed in that attack. I do hope to get to the history of Israel, Lebanon, the Sabra and Shatila massacres. The anniversary was in September, 42nd anniversary, and how Israel and Lebanon and Hezbollah appear headed toward the abyss once more. And on upcoming episodes of History as It Happens, we will be dealing with the anniversary of the October 7th, 2023 Hamas attack on Israel. In the meantime, make sure you sign up for my newsletter, again, at historyasithappens.com, or you can search for History as It Happens on Substack.
Wesley Financial Group is not a law firm.
Do you find yourself stuck in a timeshare? Get the real facts about the timeshare industry and your options for cancellation. Chuck McDowell, founder of Wesley Financial Group, has put together a free information guide that reveals the secrets the timeshare industry doesn't want you to know, including the 5 ways to get rid of your timeshare. Get this timeshare cancellation guide absolutely free.
Get your free guide at iCancelTimeshare.com. That's iCancelTimeshare.com. iCancelTimeshare.com.